What's up, everyone? You're listening to the Grepcast from TSP LLC, bringing you a weekly look into the world of technology and technology-adjacent ephemera. My name is Adam Fisk, and today we are joined by Michael O.
Hello.
And for first time on the podcast, special guest Ben Pender-Cudlip, co-director of the film Dawnland.
Hey, how are you?
Okay, so Ben, you are a TSP alum, so that means you can get right in with yelling about technology and how it's kind of bad all the time, but equally interesting, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so first thing that we'll touch on is I feel like every company now is doing their best to try and make it so that we don't adopt any smart technology. And latest on the page is Samsung, who let us know that, hey, you know what? You might as well run some antivirus scans on your TV, because that's a pretty normal thing to think about.
Yeah, they tweeted it out. They're saying, oh, on our new high-end QLED TVs to get the best experience, scan for malware every once in a while. Yeah.
I mean, I checked my toaster for malware this morning, didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh, you
How'd
probably
you do
run
that?
an ad blocker on your toaster. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah. The bananas thing is, it doesn't say every once in a while. In the now deleted tweet, which is A+ perfect, it's every few weeks. It's not when you remember. It's like, hey, you should make a calendar event that just pings you to say, you know what, let's see if like some weird hacker is just trying to listen to what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, I have all of my appliances on my calendar with weekly reminders to run antivirus. I mean, the great thing about this Verge article is they were like, well, why doesn't it just run it automatically?
Yeah, this is an article brought to us by The Verge and 500 other outlets because, again, this is a crazy thing to request your customers to do. This was written by John Porter. He goes in and says, the obvious question here is, why in the world doesn't Samsung just automate this process? Like, if we are now talking about how Apple is integrating in bigger privacy buttons, trying to create a new walled atmosphere and walled ecosystem, isn't there just a way that this TV could run like a cron job, like a scheduled job to say, hey, is there malware here? So in this case, this isn't the first black eye for Samsung. Samsung, who in 2017 was revealed by WikiLeaks that the CIA had developed a piece of software that they called Weeping Angel, which
great
cool.
name.
I just want to be the person that comes up with cool names for all these terrible things, that was capable of turning Samsung smart TVs into listening devices. So this is a company who had listening capabilities, and I think there was even articles that have come out, honestly, within the last few days that have resurfaced that issue for Samsung, that it is not only the CIA, but other hacker groups have turned the Samsung TV into just a microphone. And then less than a month later in 2017, research teams found 40 zero-day vulnerabilities in their own TV operating system, which they called Tizen. So it begs to question, is it Samsung asking for malware, or is it just saying, hey, we probably missed some other stuff and we'll just like float in updates and we want you to grab it?
So what kind of TV do you have, Ben, as a documentary filmmaker? Are you like need the top 4K OLED LG, or you don't actually have, something quite as expensive as that?
It's funny. So we have whatever TV my wife had 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. That's some rando LED TV, LCD TV that we have on our wall. Actually, I have a no documentaries in the home rule. I'm not joking. Like, I don't watch nonfiction at home because it's too much like work. So if we're watching TV, it's either a silly or an action movie or something like that. So.
That's great.
Nothing wrong with that. Like, hey, man.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We should have like a no computer, no phone rule at our home, but that doesn't really work.
Yeah, harder and harder now that your girls are just like on and doing Python scripting? I don't know, man.
Right? Yeah, exactly. I wish they're learning the violin. That's the most analog thing that we have in the house right now. So, but yeah, I mean, I guess Ben, if it's 5 or 6 or 7 years old, then it might not be smart, and in which case you're probably the safest of the three of us in terms of our TV appliances being hacked.
Yeah, it is not smart. I appreciate that. We do have a one of those Sonos Beam sound bars, but
right.
I've turned the microphone off. Like, we don't use Alexa on any of those things.
Right.
So it sounds great,
really
and it's not listening to me, so that's good.
Yeah. No, I mean, I got a Sonos One with the Alexa integration, and the thing that just sort of annoyed me about it was sort of knowing how much money I was gonna have to spend in the Sonos ecosystem in order to sort of get sound all over the place, you know? And yeah, eventually I returned it because I was like, well, I wasn't ready for the $1,000, you know, sort of Sonos kind of entry fee for like a 4-speaker system. But I do like the Beam, actually. It looks pretty cool.
Yeah, it sounds good for the size too. And we went the other direction. We do have kind of a handful of Sonoses scattered around the house now, and it's nice.
Yeah, it is convenient. It is. I mean, they've got a great platform. So
yeah, we did. Some of them are the old ones, but we do have at least the Beam and then the new Play one, whichever one, the one with Alexa.
Right.
It's got better hardware on the inside, so you can actually use AirPlay to it, as long as
that's cool.
You can have like older speakers in a group with the new speaker with Alexa, and you can AirPlay to that if you want.
Yeah. Well, I think ultimately the reason I returned it is because my wife said it doesn't have a volume knob or decent buttons that I can change channels with. And I was like, but it's on the app. And she's like, nope. I just want to walk up to it like an old style radio and change the channel.
I have lived many years of my life with a Mac Mini as a TV, so I have only been using VNC apps on my phone. So
that's not knowledge.
Yeah.
I get it. Some days I don't wanna.
Yeah. You deal with all this technology at work. That's your way of sort of just unplugging.
Yeah,
not,
just by
not
adding
actually
more
unplugging.
technology. Yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. VNC, that's a word that hasn't been spoken on Grepcast as of yet.
Yeah. If you don't know that word, thank God. Like, maybe you shouldn't have. Maybe I didn't have, or shouldn't have, rather. But
yeah, well, you're not as old as us. That's why.
Yeah. So also from The Verge, we are brought a really intriguing article. I have personally never been one to disparage iMessage. I rather enjoy it quite a bit. But this is an article written by Dieter Bohn called Why I Turned on iMessage. Encrypted chat is a moral imperative. So this is a take and an idea that I've never really thought about in the way that Dieter goes through. It's not saying that he turned it on because of the blue bubble social pressure, quote unquote, where those with iPhones who are maybe demean those who send under the green bubble. But it's because in this article, the quote is, I have come to believe that using a secure chat is an increasingly a moral imperative, and I have failed utterly and completely to convince enough people in my social network to switch to a third-party end-to-end encrypted chat app.
Yeah, this is I had a hard time kind of like following the logic, but part of it is mainly because he's approaching it from the other side. I mean, I've always had Apple devices, I've always had iPhones. I love iMessage for the functionality aspect of it. I haven't really, I use it all the time, and so I haven't sort of sat there and gone, well, should I or shouldn't I use this particular app because it's encrypted end to end, etc. But it does bring up a lot of interesting factors around messaging apps, around interoperability, and around the idea of encrypted chat. And when you look under the hood, you're communicating words to people, but largely most people know about encryption, know generally what it is, but they don't really activate it in their lives as something where, you know, they should be conscious of it. So I'm interested, Ben, to hear your perspective on it. I mean, as a documentary filmmaker, as a journalist, like, when did encrypted chat sort of show up on your radar, and like, how does it sort of work in your world?
Sure. So since vaguely the Snowden revelations, it's become clear that it's a thing that people working at least in sort of that space, the national security space, need to think about. Or when you're working with, you know, sources or individuals who are in a potentially compromising position. You know, when the election rolled around, some members in my team and I looked at each other and we're like, okay, we're using Signal now, because there's, you know, a very real possibility of journalists being targeted for doing, you know, journalism. And it's also become clear, I mean, it seems very clear to me that email, for instance, is skywriting, right? Like, if you email it, it's going to be on a server somewhere. It's transmitted in plain text. And, you know, how many different people do we know that have had their emails hacked?
This week or
exactly. So, you know, the idea of being able to communicate privately is really useful, and it's not just for people with something to hide. You know, I think it makes a lot of sense that it's end-to-end encryption in iMessage is the default. You know, apps like Signal go a little bit farther than that, right? So they have, you know, the disappearing messages feature, so that you can have messages disappear on your phone and the recipient's phone after sort of a set amount of times. There literally isn't a paper trail, if you will, left on either one of those phones. So, yeah, I think it's a useful way to be able to communicate by default.
I think it's interesting. I mean, you bring up the sort of the question of you know, do you have something to hide? And it's such a standard response, I think, to a lot of the topics that we cover on Grepcast, of data breaches, data leakage, and all this kind of stuff. And like, I think there tends to be this very black and white view of data, and bad data, good data, or bad people, good people. So, you know, you're using encryption because you have something to hide, because you're in a certain fields. But I think journalism is really interesting because it has suddenly been that intersection of, okay, well, it makes sense in the national security world to use encryption because, well, that's the nature of the beast, spies and all that kind of stuff, right? But, you know, like you said, like, journalism, it is now, as we know with the current sort of political kind of atmosphere, something where you're not doing anything wrong. Some people would argue you're doing something really good for the world, but you really have to, you know, watch out for your communications. And it's quite interesting to see other areas of the world that will also end up in that intersection, not just because of the political situation, but just individuals and other occupations.
Yeah, I mean, it's about privacy, right? So it's the ability for an individual to have control themselves over their own privacy. And obviously we're seeing that eroded in all sorts of different aspects of being online, like social networks and Facebook and metadata and tracking and all of those things. But you know, being able to have a say over how your information is controlled and how it's used and who has access to it is, some would like, arguably a right, you know?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh, 100%. We even spent some time talking about it during a recent episode around Apple's new single sign-on implementation, where privacy, to your point, is a human right. It's not something that you have to have that technological literacy, that savvy to understand, oh, I need to go through this app and like do my research and all these different things. No, like, we should have the privacy of our own homes and our own virtual homes now, which is our social networks. That won't exist because the world is a broken dumpster fire, but it's one of these things that I do want to commend Apple, as much as sometimes I do feel bad about kind of jumping on that bandwagon so fervently sometimes, but privacy as a platform is something that they seem to be embracing. And even in this article, Dieter Bohn puts it very specifically and very perfectly that privacy isn't just for people savvy enough to use the right app or flip the right button. No, it is for everybody, and that's what we need to be kind of raising to the surface. Because encryption's a scary word when you really put it I feel like the "you have nothing to hide" is very much a bad faith argument that has infected so many people when it comes to privacy, when it comes to encryption, it comes to all these different things of, oh, well, not in my backyard. I am a perfect person, so you can read all my email, which is nothing but trash. But
yeah, and I think Ben, you make a very very effective argument that encryption equals privacy. I mean, that's those two things are together. And if you are in this world today, there's this concept of ambient privacy that I was recently reading an article about, which we'll post in the show notes. But and there's sort of an assumption, and it's almost society is built on a certain level of privacy that's built into the fact that we have communications with each other that aren't recorded all the time. But clearly, there's a lot of companies that are eroding that. And, things like Alexa and like what you're talking about, turning off the microphone on the Sonos, it's about sort of these choices that we make to make sure that our state of ambient privacy, which is always the assumption of how we do things, remains that way. But I think a lot of companies are going the opposite direction. I mean, they're sort of, all of the features are on by default because that's how they monetize, these systems and the hardware and the software and the services. But Apple, to their credit, and one of the reasons that I can jump on the bandwagon is it's really intuitive for me looking at it as a longtime Apple user. I used iMessage because it was convenient, because it allowed me to communicate with people with iPhones very effectively and on the Apple ecosystem. And the fact that it has encryption, so there's privacy by default, is great. And that's Apple's choice many years ago. This isn't something they just turned on. They made that choice a really long time ago, and that is a great choice for them to have made for me. And it's one of the reasons I really like the platform.
Yeah, Apple also, when the San Bernardino mass shooting incident happened, they made the news in kind of a big way because they refused to unlock the suspect's phone or build in a back door for federal investigators.
Yeah.
And I remember that there was a lot of coverage at the time, right? In fact, the president,
Yeah.
maybe he was still a candidate then, I can't remember. But Trump called on people to boycott Apple. And Apple's argument, as well as anybody that is an expert in encryption technology, knows that you can't build a back door just for the good guys. Like,
Right.
if you weaken your encryption system, you're weakening it for everybody, both good actors and bad actors.
So, Ben, on that really uplifting notes about privacy and encryption and all these different things, our TV's listening to us. You are a TSP alum,
Yes.
but more notably to me, because we did not work together, so I know you only from Dawnland, is a really heavy topic, but it really did force me to read a lot more into there. I grew up a portion of my life in Phoenix, in Arizona, so the native communities in that area was very prevalent for me as I was growing up. So coming to the East Coast, I definitely had some assumptions of how, this is a completely different environment and how it approaches its native communities. Do you want to give us a brief kind of synopsis or background on what Dawnland is about?
Sure. So Dawnland is a documentary film that I co-directed with Adam Mazo. It came out last year, and it's about the United States federal state government policies of removing Native American children from their homes and placing them in white homes and non-Native homes for the purpose of being assimilated into non-Native culture, for the purpose of losing their identity as Native peoples.
So I guess the easy question, more like traditional non-technology podcast, is how did this topic come up to yourself and Adam to be a thing that you wanted to not only investigate but to bring to the wider public, to show and really, to borrow kind of a very worn phrase, shine a light on it?
Sure. So my filmmaking partner, Adam Mazo, came to me in it was maybe 2012, something like that, and was like, hey, there's this thing starting in Maine. There's an investigation. Did you know that Native American children have continued to be taken from their homes and given to white families just because they're Native? And I was like, what?
Yeah.
Because I grew up in the States, in Connecticut. I went to public school, and it wasn't something that I learned about in sort of the
books,
middle class,
anything,
largely non-native public school that I went to. And, you know, the history goes back to the founding of this country, right? So when Europeans came over, at first the policies were outright genocide and physical destruction. Then the policies, shifted to assimilation and creating, in the late 1800s, boarding schools where Native American children were taken from their families and communities, sent hundreds of miles away, in many cases, really terrible conditions. They'd be beaten if they spoke their language. Hair would be cut. And these boarding schools taught Native American children trades so that they could be, quote unquote, useful to
white people.
Basically.
Right.
And then those policies shifted when the child welfare system began to be established in the sort of post-war period, 40s, 50s. And you've got white middle-class social workers going to Native communities, seeing conditions that are different than what they're used to. They're seeing kids maybe playing outside without shoes, or they're saying, well, you don't have enough windows in this house, or you're an unwed mother. We need to take your child. So they were looking at a culture that wasn't theirs. They were judging it, and based on their judgment, they were removing kids, and they were removing a lot of kids. Actual numbers from the 1970s show that between 1/3 and 1/4 of all Native children in the United States at that time were living outside of their homes in foster care or boarding school, and like. That's extraordinary, or adoptive homes. That's an extraordinary number of children. And so how do communities survive when they lose their children? And the answer is, well, in many cases, they can't. So it's a more, it's a quieter form of cultural genocide. You know, it's a different way of eliminating cultures. But that's what it is. So the film we made, Dawnland, followed the first official Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States, which happened in Maine between 2013 and 2015. And so this commission was formed sort of in the model of TRCs that have happened in places like South Africa after apartheid, or Sierra Leone or Rwanda. There were processes like this after genocide. And the commission was an agreement between state and tribal governments, and it was an investigation into this practice in the state of Maine specifically. So our film followed the 5 commissioners, Native and non-Native commissioners, as they traveled around the state and gathered testimony from individuals from Native and non-Native communities in Maine. So they visited all of the Wabanaki communities, that's the Micmac, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot, and gathered testimony from hundreds of individuals about their experiences in care, their experiences as parents who perhaps have had children removed, as community members. This is something that, as a non-Native person, I knew nothing about. And I have to say that as we were filming in communities across Maine, I discovered that this is a story that everybody in Indian country knows about. Everybody has a relative, an auntie, a cousin, an immediate family member that was in care. The difference in awareness is shocking, and it's pervasive. These stories of trauma are everywhere, and so part of the purpose of our film was to lift up the Wabanaki people in Maine that had the courage to come forward and publicly share their stories, so that it could be better for other people, so that other people wouldn't have to experience what they experienced. The commission concluded in 2015, and one of their main findings was that the state of Maine had engaged in, quote, cultural genocide, and using the child welfare system to eliminate or move toward the elimination of Native cultures. So that's our film. And
Crazy.
It was a powerful experience to make it. And it's screened at film festivals for the last year or so. You can find it at Dawnland.org. We're still doing community screenings. Educators can get the DVD, that sort of thing.
So, I mean, there's so many questions, and I mean, and it's thanks for telling us about that journey, because it isn't something which is talked about, and of course people do talk about that the winners always write history books, and the narratives are never really the truth. It's just one perspective. But how long was this going until? I mean, you talked about it in the 70s, but at what point did it stop, and kind of why did it stop, or did it just peter out? Did people realize it's a bad idea and try to hide it? How long was it going on?
I mean, a question could be, has it stopped?
Right.
So in 1978, the federal government passed the Indian Child Welfare Act. The statistics I mentioned earlier, those came about as a series of hearings in Washington, D.C., and that led to the passage, that and indigenous advocacy led to the passage of this act, which established placement preferences for when a Native child needs to go into care. So if a Native child can't live in their home, the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, says that they need to live with an immediate family member, with the tribe, or with any tribe before authorities place them outside of their community. So basically, it makes the tribe a third parent, and it's intended to maintain cultural connections for Native children that can't live with their parents. And child welfare workers across the country will tell you that ICWA is the gold standard for child welfare practice. The idea of keeping a child close to their community is something that it's an idea that we can apply to any child that needs to go into care. But this act establishes these special protections for Native children because of this really targeted history, this awful history of sort of really targeted cultural destruction.
Well, I think what's interesting about the project for me is it's not just highlighting the issue, but it's highlighting the issue in the context of the reconciliation. And this is a theme I think that Adam in particular has pulled on this thread before with his documentary film Coexist, which was, I think, around 2009 he released. And one interesting sort of TSP link is that Adam, and I forget exactly how Adam and I met, but he actually edited that film at TSP because he needed basically a Mac Pro at the time. It may have been, I don't even know if it was like a G5 or whatever 10 years ago, but he needed some decent hardware to do the editing of that film, which covers the Rwandan genocide and the reconciliation process. And I think that's how you guys met, right? I mean, how Adam and you.
Yeah, we met when I was working at TSP and he was cutting his film in the internet cafe. Exactly.
Yeah, and we were on Newberry Street. I mean, this is going back a long time in terms
of 2008-ish.
Yeah. But I do I do like, we constantly on Grepcast, we're highlighting these issues and we sort of end the episode going like, man, this all sucks. But I do like the fact that, it is a story about reconciliation, about confronting these issues, and, about the institutions that effectively had put this into place, which a lot of the time people just say, oh, that's history. That's not us, right? I mean, the state of Maine could simply say, that wasn't us in power that made those rulings. We're not going to take responsibility for it. But there is sort of a little bit of a grown-up attitude towards this, which, a lot of the time institutions don't really do those things to take responsibility, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't do it, but you have advantages right now because of that. Right. You benefit from that. I mean, we saw Mitch McConnell say that just the other day about slavery and reparations. Yeah. It's just like, oh, God. But I mean, reconciliation is an interesting word because in the beginning of this, the Truth and Reconciliation process, there was a lot of excitement about that, a lot of excitement from the white community about that. And part of our film is, frankly, about the difficulties of reconciliation. One of the people in our film, Esther, who's Passamaquoddy, and she's a child welfare advocate, and she was really instrumental in bringing about the TRC. Something that she said is that, reconciliation isn't something that you, white people, need to do with we Native people. It's something you need to do with yourselves. You need to reconcile yourselves to the truth of what you benefit from, what you've been a part of, and the ways in which you benefit from the oppression of Native peoples. So I thought that was a really interesting way of reframing reconciliation as not as something. It doesn't need to be something that you do in partnership with Native people. It's something that we non-Native people can do ourselves.
Yeah. No, it's very, very good.
So one of the things that we touched on prior to recording is you were mentioning that you started this project really when the DSLR boom was happening, and it made it easier for somebody in your standing, like kind of going off that idea of privilege, allowing you to do things, privilege of having a background in technology, being able to even get this now cheaper equipment than more traditional film stuff. Do you foresee that with the rise of really kind of the smartphone culture, that hell, the iPhone can record 5K video now, that it will become easier for people in maybe more marginalized communities to create projects to show off things that had a gatekeeping mechanic for it?
Maybe. There are a whole bunch of questions there, and I'll see if I can hit them one by one. So there's, when I left TSP in 2009, and Mike, I think TSP had been sponsoring the Independent Film Festival of Boston.
Right, yeah.
And so I took the badges that you had, and I watched a dozen films over a weekend in 2009. I still remember the films I saw.
It's like Netflix binging, except 10 years ago.
Yeah. And so I went to all those films. I was the guy in the Q&As being just like, oh, how did you make that? What's your hustle? How do you make it as a documentary filmmaker? And I saw some of those, and I was like, I could do that. And so then I came in on Monday and gave my 2 weeks. Fast forward 9 years, and I was back at the Independent Film Festival of Boston at the Somerville Theater with Dawnland and a packed house, 850 people screening this film there, which was really exciting. I got to tell that story on stage with the people that run the festival, and it was just a really great moment. But I was lucky when I left TSP that I had a background in technology, and that at that time the Canon 5D had just come out, which as a DSLR had a much larger image sensor, could use still camera lenses, and had a whole different look than traditional video cameras. And I was sort of part of the wave of people that, not because we were any good, but just because we...
it was just super raw gumption.
Well, just because we, could buy these frankly pretty cheap cameras and create these images, I started getting hired and making good rates as a shooter, just because I could create this look that more established people in the industry hadn't quite gotten on board, or were in the process of getting on board with. And so that really propelled a lot of my early career after leaving TSP. And so, so there's a democratization of camera technology. And like you said, nowadays, iPhones are recording 4K and, have built-in stabilization and all that stuff. So the bar to entry certainly has become lower in terms of being able to acquire the technology to make a good picture and to record good sound. It'll probably continue to get lower and lower still. I think the real currency is, and always will be, the ability to tell a good story and having the access to tell a good story if it's a nonfiction story. And so that's something that technology doesn't get you at all. That's something that you practice at. And that's something that you train yourself to be able to do. And having technology that lets you get through that period of practice and lets you make work of sort of a decent quality can really help get you through that phase until you're making like truly professional work. But there's also, in terms of access and people that belong to marginalized communities having the opportunity to tell their stories, I think it's not just the technology. Certainly as an industry, the nonfiction industry, we have a long way to go, but there are more and more diversity initiatives, and overall there's more awareness about who tells what stories and why they're telling them. There's still a long way to go. But that's frankly something that was part of the conversation with Dawnland. Spoiler alert, Adam and I are both non-native, and we were making a film for 5 years in native communities in Maine.
Right.
And we were very aware of the history of people that had come before us who looked just like us, who were saying the same things we were saying. Things like, trust us, we're here to help, we're here to tell your stories, those things would be said by scientists and researchers and filmmakers and child welfare workers, right?
Of course,
there's a line in Dawnland where the woman Esther, who I mentioned earlier, says, by all intents and purposes, you represent the perpetrator. And she's talking to non-native commissioners and staff, So we were very aware of just who we are and what our presence represented. And so we spent a lot of time in community. We tried to follow best practices in terms of, not tried to follow, we did. We were very, very careful about informed consent and reconsent and reconsent, making sure that people that we wanted to be able to film, we asked them if we could film them, and then we gave them the opportunity to tell us to stop filming them. We brought the film back to communities before we finished it for notes and to learn what we could do better and how we could better represent the stories. We worked in really close partnership with Native advisors and executive producers on the film. So we tried to listen. We tried to just shut up and listen to what we were being told from the people that knew it best, from the people that had really experienced the topics of our film firsthand. They know sort of what the truth of those things are. And it's our role to listen and do our best to represent that. And we would be asked that question a lot when we spoke about the film publicly. We got really used to it, frankly. Whenever we're presenting the film to the documentary industry, in one way or another, the question would be what gives you the right to be able to tell this story? And so we talk about that, and we talk about how we were invited into the process by the individuals that had formed the commission, in part because of the strength of Adam's earlier work, Mike, that you had mentioned,
Right.
Coexist,
Yeah.
a film about the Rwandan government's present-day policy of mandatory reconciliation.
Yeah.
And the work that he and his organization, the Upstander Project, are doing to teach about genocide and colonialism and bullying and othering. I mean, that's a really good plug for the Upstander Project, that they're really walking the walk. They're not just talking about using documentary and nonfiction for impact. They actually are in, hundreds of classrooms across the country, thousands of kids and teachers learning about how these topics are relevant to their own lives.
It's fascinating, I think, to look at it from the lens. I mean, there's a lot of intellectual, questions you can ask, which are sort of theoretical. Like, what would have the film been like had you been native, right? I mean, would it have had different content? I mean,
It would have been a different film.
all right, yeah, but I think that's great to acknowledge that, to understand that, to go into this process fully acknowledging, look, that you represent the oppressors. I mean, in the sense of just the like you said. I mean, you're going in and mirroring the same language, saying trust us and all this kind of stuff. And I think that awareness is incredible. And to sort of admit, like, that we are who we are. But I think Adam's previous work does create that legitimacy. But some people would take that and just run with it. But I think that acknowledgement must have been really key for the community to accept the work. I mean, what was the reaction when you had those first screenings with the Native community? Did you go back to the drawing board? Did you re-edit the film? I mean,
Sure.
what happened?
That's a good question. And that's something that we talk about frequently on stage when we present the film with people that are in the film. So we had a rough cut of the film. And we got community members together and people that were on the commission and people that had given testimony to the commission. And we showed the rough cut and the room was quiet. And then we circled up and we got our asses kicked for an hour. We had made some mistakes. There were some ways that people felt very, very strongly. We hadn't done a good job representing the community, and particularly there were some scenes toward the end where people felt that the feelings of white folks overpowered the impact and the story that was happening to community members. And so we listened and took lots of notes, and we came back to Boston. And, some of those scenes, we thought some of those scenes were critical scenes. We thought they were, we didn't see how we could make a film without those. But we were like, okay, well, let's try. And so we started removing some more. And you know what? It still worked. And it worked better. And the balance of the film shifted even more toward telling the stories of Native people. And to telling the right stories, and so, that's like I said, that's a moment we talk about, when we screen the film, we often screen it and do Q&As with people that were in it and a lot of the people that were in that room, and we talk about that together. That was a teachable moment and a moment when we could have doubled down and said, we're the experts, we're the filmmakers, trust us, and
then just been exactly what they were fearing you guys were.
Exactly.
When you were coming in.
And honestly, that wasn't, we couldn't possibly have done that. That would have been antithetical to who we are. And even though it was difficult to listen deeply and hear through the pain, frankly, the pain of the people that were, yet again having to tell some white people how to get their act together. The film improved, and it's something that we're really proud of, and it's something that we've heard from a lot of our friends in Maine that they feel represented in, and so Yeah, I mean, it's also the first, so that the film screened on public television in late 2018 on Independent Lens. And to our knowledge, it's the first time Wabanaki people, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot people have been featured on a nationally televised program.
Wow.
It's the first time that, the film was scored with the voices of elders from those communities. It was a really, really big deal. And we're humbled to have been able to help make that happen.
And you do have a screening coming up in the Boston area August 1st. You have a screening with Adam, in this case, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. If you go to dawnland.org/screenings, you can find a lot more information on there. Ticket info is to be announced at this point, but you can definitely go onto there and check that out. And I would really, really strongly recommend that if you're listening to this, go check it out. It opened my eyes specifically to things that I think I had relegated to, oh, that's old history. That's things that happened a long time ago, not within kind of the lifetime of people I know.
Yeah, and I'll also say that on our website, dawnland.org, we have free learning materials about the film. So there's a viewer's guide. And if you are somebody you love as a teacher, there is a 140-odd page teacher's guide, which is completely free. So you can, learn how to use the film in your classroom. We'd love to hear from you. The film is available for educational screenings, community screenings. And all of that is at dawnland.org.
Awesome. So that is the time that we have today on this episode of the Grepcast. Thank you again. Thank you, Ben, for coming on. This is awesome.
This is amazing. Thank you.
It's always nice to hear someone who knows what they're talking about really go on. Like, this has been amazing. But you can always find out anything that TSP is up to over on our website, tsp.me and tsp.space. And I will give another plug for Ben, dawnland.org. Go check it out. And you can always find us over on Instagram at TSP-LLC. In terms of additional plugs today, do you have anything, Mike?
Well, I will sort of, it seems silly to plug anything other than the topic at hand because it's amazing. And thanks, Ben, for coming on. So I'll ask a question, which will be my plug. What's your next project? What's the next thing that you'd like the world to sort of know about?
We're working on a couple of things. We have 2 short films in the Dawnland universe that we're in post-production on right now. One of them is following an elder who gave her testimony to the commission and has her own story of being in care and her own sort of journey of rediscovering herself and her childhood. And the other film is the other film we shot the other month in the Massachusetts State House, where in the 1700s, the colonial government at the time established a bounty proclamation on the heads of Penobscot Indians. If you brought dead Penobscots to the Massachusetts State House, you'd get paid a lot of money. So in partnership with some of our Penobscot friends and in collaboration with them, we had 3 Penobscot families read this proclamation in the space where it was signed. And so that's a short film of putting together an act of reclaiming this narrative and helping sort of share the fact that Native people in this territory were literally hunted.
Well, great work, Ben. It's great to bring these stories to light.
So until we talk to you again, stay cool.
See ya.
Thanks.